Hi, so I was given two extracts to read this week on Ibn Khaldun. That was the Islamic biography of Ibn Khaldun's political theory by Hamilton Gibb, and Ibn Khaldun, an intellectual biography by Robert Owen. Both the extracts focus kind of around his Muqaddimah and the idea of the cyclical notion of states along with Asabiyyah. So the first extract I read was the Islamic background of Ibn Khaldun's political theory by Hamilton Gibb. This was a bulletin that was posted in SOAS. So Hamilton Gibb was a strong, heavily devoted Christian, so he focused kind of on the religious view of Khaldun, or the religious aspects of him. So he kind of starts by highlighting that other historians, such as Dr. Rosenthal, downplay the role of religion as just kind of one factor of a series of factors, whereas Gibb has this idea that religion is kind of the dominating factor in Khaldun's ideas. He kind of talks about how it's the most important thing and it dominates his view of everything and takes precedent. This was because Khaldun would have been a strict Muslim, and so there would be nothing in his rational thought that wouldn't be from an Islamic viewpoint. He kind of progresses this by explaining how there's two types of religion, so there's true religion and acquired religion, and he comments on the fact that Asabiyyah would be doomed to fail if they didn't have a real sense of religious belief behind them, and that's kind of what results in the cycle of states that Khaldun talks about. He furthers this with the notion that true religion and Asabiyyah work together to conquer cities, because people are fulfilling God's purpose, especially as part of the Asabiyyah, and it's like a divine purpose and it all stems from God. So group unity is kind of one of the things that God wants, and so that's group unity is when they're then going in as tribes and kind of being together and like conquering cities. And so citizens are no longer defining this said purpose when they're city dwellers and not independent or don't have as stronger Asabiyyah, and that leads them to being conquered by tribes. This also then links to Sharia law, and Gibb kind of talks about the fact that humans' animal instincts stop a person from fully following Sharia law and so stray from pure religion, again creating the cycle, because as they depart from following Sharia laws closely, they also depart from the idea of Asabiyyah. So, yeah. And Gibb's kind of main thing here, or in this book, was that article was that instead of seeing Khaldun as a sociological thinker like a lot of people such as Rosenthal do, he's kind of a thinker with a moral and religious basis. So I'm going to focus most of my presentation on Irwin's book because it was a little bit longer to read, so there's a lot more to cover. So his work is a bit more widespread and a vast account and analysis of many different historians' perspectives of Khaldun, finishing up with his own, so I'm going to briefly skim over quite a few of the historians. He gives background to the discovery of the Muqaddimah in the West and how it was first discovered by, sorry for my pronunciation, Antoine Sylvester de Sacy and Jonathan von Hammer-Purgstall, as seen on the screen. They discovered it at the beginning of the 19th century, which starts the westernised approach to Khaldun that was then seen throughout history. Although these people were both well versed in Arab history, they would have still held a Western viewpoint on Khaldun and had a Western way of thinking about him. So this Western viewpoint and the Western translations of Khaldun created disputes between historians as to what Khaldun was really talking about, what his principles really were. The multiple Western translations created discrepancies because they had their own ways of translating. Some people took it more literally, some people kind of changed it to how they would want it to be. So obviously after that, a lot of scholars spent a lot of time discussing these different translations, again creating more arguments and more discrepancies. So, for example, a original translator would be William de Slane, who was a French national as of 1838, but he came from Belfast. When faced with tricky words such as Asabiyyah, he would render them differently according to the context that they were in, and these slightly questionable translation techniques meant that later scholars could kind of change the meaning to what they wanted, and make it so that they were Khaldun's ideas were supporting his own. So, for example, someone who did this was Gautier, a geographer who believed that the fall of the Roman Empire fell upon the Arabs. He used de Slane's translations to support his apocalyptic argument about the conflict between the nomadic and the settled. He had this view that Khaldun's work was that the Arabs had no sense of country and only lineage. Gaucher also is kind of a prime example of this Western ignorant view of the Arab history, because he has this idea that he sees Arabs as children, whereas Cowden is a genius because he has a more Western viewpoint or a more Western kind of way of thinking. Irwin does acknowledge this ignorance and talks about how many scholars aim to strip Cowden of his Arab identity and turn him into the modern Frenchman. So getting rid of what he kind of originally was and what he mainly was, making them into his own, and that's kind of seen throughout all the scholars. I think this hints at Cowden's own ambiguity being used to kind of correspond with what people wanted it to correspond with. So if they wanted him to be a Western, he could be Western. So after these initial translations of the likes of Deslane, De Sacy, Purgstall, the Western world kind of forgot about him for a little while until Arnold Toynbee identified him as an intellectual ancestor. So Toynbee, like someone like Gibb, who I'll mention again in a second, was an extremely devout Christian, and so kind of had the religious views of Cowden again. And he developed Cowden's principle of the cycle of states, in that they develop and fail due to a cycle of challenges and responses, again linking to religion. He too was influenced by the kind of ignorant Western view, like Gautier, who was someone that he read. He saw Cowden as a scholar with Western thinking and Arabs kind of more childish. He definitely patronised the Arab heritage and kind of patronised Cowden's Arab heritage, although it must be said that although he was very supportive and saw Cowden as this amazing person, he did see sometimes that his ideas were a bit too narrow, which kind of, I guess, again links into the ambiguity. And although Toynbee's views were kind of rather narrow due to his initial readings and the Westernised view, he did repopularise Cowden, resulting in more Western scholars reading him, giving more opinions, and kind of people who go on to be less Western about him. Gibb, as mentioned before, was heavily Christian, so he saw Cowden as somewhat of a religious thinker, moral basis, and he obviously believed that the religious law shaped Cowden's thinking and focused on the divine nature. He believed that Cowden sought to show that Islamic history was a product of incompatibility between religion and men. So Irwin believes that that's what Gibb was trying to do, which, as seen kind of why am I talking about the first extract, is quite true. He definitely was talking about the way that like human instincts work with religion, and when it doesn't work, obviously the state falls. So although Irwin spends a lot of his time talking about scholars who had a religious view of Cowden, he also talks about people who didn't view him as a theologian, but as a sociologist. For example, Yves Lacoste, an anti-colonialist and a Marxist, presented a kind of Marxist and economic version of the Muqaddimah. He recognised, or his view was that Cowden described a society that was run by military democracy and aristocracy, and that Cowden criticised societies in which the bourgeoisie had failed to monopolise means of production, and this would be in the second and third generations. Not only this, but Lacoste did actually actively dismiss the French colonialists for westernising Cowden, even though he himself, Owen picks up on this, he himself did the exact same thing by making Cowden a Marxist before Marxism even existed. Someone else who identifies Irwin as having a less religious viewpoint was Gellner, a philosopher who suggested that Cowden should be seen as a predecessor of the likes of Maynard Keynes. Gellner was a Weberian. Anyway, Gelden kind of created Cowden to be an image of his own, an inductive sociologist, a practitioner, long before those terms were invented. So again, Irwin's picking up on these people, making him into what they want him to be. And although Gellner was not wrong, Irwin kind of identifies the fact that he ignored Cowden's praise for Puritanism and monotheism, which is in its for the Arabs and the Berbers, which is a criticism on Gellner, but it's also quite funny because it highlights that Irwin, like many other scholars, took on these views, these ideologies with face value rather than looking into deeper structures, because he kind of misses points that Cowden was trying to say. So it's kind of funny because Irwin was so critical of those others, but at the same time he was also doing and like missing greater points, but perhaps this is down to Cowden's ambiguity. I'm just going to quickly touch on some more scholars who Irwin talks about and they stood out to me in their perceptions. So Taha Hussein, who was Egypt's leading intellectual in the 20th century, praised Cowden as a genius, but denied the typical view that he was a scientific historian or a sociologist, and that unlike a lot of Western thinkers believe, he was not a modern-style historian as he neglected documentary evidence. He also denounced the religious views of Cowden, saying that his apparent religiosity was only precautionary. so it wasn't as deep a thinking. Though I myself disagree with this, because I feel like even if it wasn't as strong as some people say, he would have still had a strong religious viewpoint due to being an Arab Muslim. A scholar named Annan linked him to Machiavelli, which Irwin criticises this idea, however, because he kind of links the Muqaddimah and the Prince. But obviously there were lots of different ideas. For example, Machiavelli wanted to keep religion out of politics, but Khaldun kind of was accepting of them being intertwined. Someone else would also be Al-Asma. He criticises Khaldun's philosophy as consisting of a series of unsupported generalizations that were pretty conventional for the time, so not this modern Western thinking that they all believed, and that he was forgotten about until rescued by Westerners for a reason. And then there was Stephen Dale, who argues that his methodology was Aristotelian. However, Irwin kind of criticises this as there was unlikely to be a direct link, just due to the fact that his access to Aristotle had been very restricted. Dale also links Khaldun to Galen, the Greek physician. Again, Irwin argues this as there's no direct evidence that Khaldun had grasped any of Galen's methodology. It was only because he was mentioned a couple of times in the Muqaddimah. So finally, in this very quick analysis of the text, Robert Irwin, through the use of all these scholars, highlights a point which I myself find fascinating, that there's not one correct view on Khaldun. Almost every scholar mentioned in this chapter, and there were a lot more than I mentioned, had their own view, be it from originality stemming from another's translation, or even another's research and commentary on the translation. The scholars and the historians used Khaldun's ambiguity to further support their own beliefs. Gautier, for example, was able to manipulate Khaldun in order to support his own ideas. Irwin kind of identifies these different arguments and uses each historian to criticise or praise the other as evidence in his arguments. So, say he's got one historian, he'll change or back them up or argue them with another. Each scholar's own religious, political, or social beliefs impacted their Khaldun. Perhaps that's the whole point of Khaldun, that his ideas are so easily manipulated that you can kind of have him as whatever you want him to be. His ambiguous ideas mean that you can shape him into whatever you want. Robert Irwin acknowledges all of this and comes to the conclusion that obviously as post-colonial period studies kind of increased of him as to differing opinions, while every historian had a different view of him, what was kind of linking them all was the fact that they've all made him their own, perhaps due to Khaldun's own ambiguity or their ignorance of having the belief that everyone has their beliefs, or each may be missing the bigger picture, or each kind of a mixture of all. Irwin himself is critical of all of these people, but in himself is doing the same, creating his own Khaldun, his own view of Khaldun. And he kind of sums up the chapter with this quote from Michael Brett, which I think is summing up perfectly the fact that Khaldun continues to mean all things to all men as a measure of his greatness as well as ambiguity. And I think that's exactly right, because he's great enough to still be spoken about today, and that's mostly down to the ambiguity of his ideas.